5 out of the 6 games at the Tata Steel Masters tournament today were decisive. Let's take a look at a couple of them. First of all, the game between Pentala Harikrishna with the white pieces against Hikaru Nakamura. We joined the game in a kind of Spanish type position where you can see the central pawns are locked. It actually arose out of Sicilian, but it's basically a Spanish type structure. And Nakamura has given up a pawn, but he has, well, a little bit of compensation. This pawn on c3 is rather backward, and he's looking to play the knight into c4. Now, I was anticipating that white would perhaps cover that with knight d2, and then we might get a situation like this, perhaps knight in here, and well, I think black has some compensation in this position. This bishop has potentially some targets here. This knight isn't very good here. But instead, Harikrishna came up with, I think, a good idea. Well, that said with hindsight. The queen and bishop control this diagonal. So it means that, well, white will try to get rid of the 2 bishops. It's always a good idea, even though this bishop doesn't seem to be a very good piece, because it's rather blocked in. Actually, it means that after the exchange, this pawn will be permanently vulnerable. And you never know, it could even weaken black's king position. Nakamura threw the knight in, and the bishop came to h6. And here, I think Nakamura realised that if he exchanged pieces, you know, he really ought to exchange off this active rook, but if he does that, then he will be on the wrong end of a draw. Well, what I mean is, it's impossible for black to win this position. Only white has winning chances. Now, maybe if black defends accurately, he might be able to draw, but this is no fun at all to defend. Let me see. If the queen defends here, then maybe queen b4. You can see how that pawn is a weakness, and then white will try to maneuver these knights around. This is very unpleasant for black to defend. So Nakamura, well, he's a maximalist. He wants to get the most out of the position. He didn't want to back down. He didn't want to exchange into a poor ending, and played queen c5. This was a terrible mistake, and he simply overlooked white's next move. Perhaps he was anticipating that this rook would have to retreat down the a file, and then he's achieved something. But instead, Harikrishna threw the knight into the attack, and this is absolutely crushing. First, let's see what happens if you take the knight. Then check, and it's simply forced checkmate. Very, very simple indeed. And then we take on f7. That's the end of the story. What else have we got? What happens if we take the rook? Also extremely unpleasant. A check we take here. If this is taken, then it's terribly simple. The queen comes in, and notice this pawn on h3 gives the king an escape square, so white's king completely safe. There's one mad move here. Instead of taking the bishop, what about throwing the knight in to block? But then this bishop just takes on d6. The rook's threatened, the pawn is threatened, the knight is threatened. It's all over for black. And apart from that, let me see any other alternatives. Well, let's just see the game continuation. An incredible move from Nakamura. In this position he's completely lost, but he still finds a way to try and complicate. Well, if knight takes, then the rook is en prise, and maybe white still has black still has a chance. But instead, Harikrishna kept his head and moved in for the kill. Knight f6 mate threatened, and after f5 to give the king a square, knight g5, and that's all over. Queen h7 mate or knight f6 mate on the next turn. Very efficient finish from Harikrishna. However, I feel that actually Nakamura kind of committed suicide there. He didn't need to lose so quickly. So Nakamura having a miserable tournament. He's now on 3 out of 8. not the best. I would have predicted that he was one of the favourites for the tournament, and Harikrishna comes up to 50%. Let's take a look at another game. This is the game between Dominguez from Cuba against Wesley So from the Philippines. Both players having a pretty good tournament. They're both on 4 out of 7. Let's see what happened. Dominguez with the white pieces. Wesley So played the Petrov, or the Russian defence. And Dominguez played a line which has become quite popular over the last few years. He's not playing sort of classically with d4, but this is a very pragmatic way for white to play. What white does is castle on the opposite side to black and then attempt a pawn storm. And the great thing about this from white's viewpoint is that you risk very little, because on the queen side you have these 4 solid pawns protecting your king. So yeah, a very good practical variation for white. Now here the main moves are either knight c6 or knight to d7, and sometimes the knight comes to e5, sometimes to f6. That's the most popular and most reliable way to play for black. But Wesley So played this rather trendy move, pawn to b6. Of course, the bishop, in theory, stands well on the long diagonal. There's pressure there. But there are disadvantages to this move, namely that the bishop comes off this diagonal and can make it a bit easier for white to attack. This is quite a new move. It's been played a couple of times by the Chinese player Wang Hao. He managed to defeat Caruana with this, but he lost to Nakamura. Castles queenside from Dominguez. And now in the games I've just mentioned, white played knight d4, which is quite logical actually, a dangerous move. Now that the bishop has moved from c8, the knight can come to this dangerous square on f5. But Dominguez played in very simple fashion h4, so he's starting this pawn storm. Big idea for white is to open up a file on the king side. You can see white's bishop's pointing in the right direction. It's not such a simple position for black to defend. One of the reasons is that this queen actually doesn't have a good square, which means the rooks aren't connected. You can see that white has very good coordination here. Good connection with the rooks, and the bishops look very good as well. I think the most testing move here is to play the knight c5, trying to eliminate that bishop, and then white has to decide, do you take on c5, do you maybe move this bishop, or do you leave it there? Then it's not so simple, I think. But in the game, black played knight f6, and after this move, I think it's an excellent move. Then already white, I think, has a tremendous initiative. Wesley So fought for 45 minutes here, and I think that's an indication of how difficult his position is. I mean, one simple idea with playing the bishop here is to open up the line for the queen just to move over to the king side. Very simple indeed. There are other moves as well. Knight g5 is a possibility, and you can knock out the knight and come into h7. So bishop d4, an excellent move and clearly underestimated by the Philippine player. He played c5, which is a very forcing move. So just forcing white really to give up the 2 bishops. But of course c5 means that this pawn is backward. And white still has 1 bishop here pointing at the king. And this bishop, you could say that black has the advantage of the 2 bishops, but this bishop doesn't achieve much because it's just biting on this pawn. There's nothing to do there. Now I think one very solid move for white would be to play bishop c4, and there's no doubt that white has a big positional advantage here, maybe just even playing the bishop into d5 and hammering down on d6. But instead Dominguez played for the attack, and this is also very logical indeed. I mean, he can still play to try and win this pawn, but he's just moving the queen over to the king side. So advanced with d5, I think he has to do something about that pawn. Now there are many ways to continue, maybe g4, maybe knight g5. Dominguez played with h5. Now, if we can see one of the points of the move is simply to play queen f5, force g6, and that'll open up the file, and then the queen comes down. Wesley So played rook e8, and that gives potentially his king an escape square. But Dominguez kept charging on. I mean, it's such an easy position for white to play. It's another example of how it's much easier to play with the initiative than it is to defend. Now here, maybe black's best chance is to play d4. I still think this is a very uncomfortable position. One of the ideas is, after taking, to play queen d5, and that attacks two pieces. But okay, there are many alternatives to white after d4. Instead, Wesley So played g6, and this is really asking for trouble. There was a very natural attacking continuation. I think Wesley So must have overlooked this move. Rook h7, lovely idea. Actually, it's a stock sacrifice. We see this, for example, in the dragon variation. A simple idea: if king takes, then queen takes f7, preventing the king coming back, and on the next turn, rook h1 will be mate. Wesley So tried d4, but this opened up this diagonal, and this is absolutely horrible. I mean, there are all kinds of ideas here. If this is blocked, then we take here, we give a check, and rook h1, for example. So it's very, very difficult. I mean, maybe, well, one tries to take this off, but now we can take here, and this is probably black's best defense, but this is still very unpleasant. Threat, queen h6 mate, the rook comes here, we take this, black takes the pawn on g5. Well, white is the exchange down, but the king is so exposed that white really should win this position. Instead, Wesley So played queen e7, protecting the f7 square, but after this he resigned. Let's take a look and see why he resigned. Well, if bishop takes f3, then this wins straight away. Check. King moves to the side, and g6. Even though white is a rook down, it really doesn't matter at all. The threat of taking here, threat of check here, it's completely over. Maybe the best try was queen d6, but this is going to lose. And unsurprisingly, white is winning this position. I mean, the only chance is for black to give up this rook. But here, well, we do this sacrifice again. And I'm sure there are many ways to win this position, but this is very attractive. Forcing black to take. And we give a check. Another check. And now g6, and that pawn is going to go home. Maybe there are other ways to win, but that's actually pretty straightforward. So that win brought Dominguez to 5 points. Let me see. The top game of the day, Anish Giri against Levon Aronian, that was actually a draw. That was the only draw today. So Aronian has 6 points. Karyakin managed to defeat Gelfand. Poor old Boris having a rough time. So Aronian has 6 points. Karyakin has 5.5. Giri has 5 points. Caruana defeated Rapport, he has 5 points, and Dominguez has 5 as well. So it's kind of bunching at the top. Aronian just ahead, but only by half a point. 3 rounds still to go.